Welcome to Truth Talk, and we're in a series where we are discussing at length, not short, not little small snippets, at length, the study of clothes and why they matter. What is the psychology around it, and what really goes into how someone dresses, why they dress certain ways. And there's a few things that we want to establish from the get-go. Number one, we have no choice but to take clothing as a serious nonverbal form of communication. Clothing can provide important information about the sex, age, occupation, origin, sexual appetites, personality, attitudes, and the values of the wearer. Now, there is a symbolic power to clothing, both in terms of what it hides as well as what it reveals. It has everything to do with identity. And in this discussion, it's not only identity, but how we perceive it. Now, what I'm going to discuss is really Genesis chapter 27, and that is Jacob and Esau, the garments of disguise. Now, this is garments that are used to reveal or conceal someone's identity. So really what this is talking about is assuming one's identity or the identity of someone else. What are the psychological outcomes of such an assumption? And so when we're dealing with the reality of what we put on and what we wear, there is the importance of not only who we are, but who we're attempting to be, okay? And this is extremely important. Now, what we have here is there needs to be a little bit of a backdrop here. The rabbis believed and taught through different midrashes that clothes was so important that they were handed down from generation to generation. So from Noah down to the next generation to the next. And so you'll hear me talk a little bit about Esau and what rabbinical teaching believes about Esau. Now, the reality in that is they believed that Nimrod was a mighty hunter, a great hunter, and they believed that he had inherited these divine garments. Now, I don't particularly agree or believe that, but if you're studying any of the rabbis' writings or textual criticisms on this, you'll need to understand this backdrop. And so in understanding that he, in a way, inherited this down from Noah. Now, Esau is supposed to have, this is a heavy supposed to have, and that's what you got to be careful with midrashes is they can make up more stuff than you can keep track of. Anyhow, the rabbis believe that somehow Esau took over Nimrod's clothes, got them from him, and that's what made Esau the great hunter that he was. Now, whether you believe this or not, I don't necessarily. However, I do want you to see and understand that in the rabbinic teaching, these garments and the meaningfulness of it, that there is myth that gathers up around clothing and around how someone dresses and what someone is in regard to their clothing. And so they have the midrashes talk about a generational passing on of these garments. And they ask deep questions about the mythological application of passing garments down. And they ask if we have cajoled or badgered them, talking about their children, enough so that they have grudgingly taken the garments that we hold dear, or do they remain hidden in the bottom of a chest, never to be worn? Much of that depends on how we pass it down. So, for instance, if you wanted to study, it's a great study on generational passing on of values. And so the Midrash gets involved in that. I particularly am not going to get involved in that. And what I want to get involved in is in the assumption of an identity. So we've already come to understand that clothing represents more than superficial covering. it reveals the identity of all that the one who wears it. Okay, so it is the garments utilized by Rebekah to disguise Jacob in our story here this week. Esau's garments, and many people don't talk about this because we jump right into the fact that Rebekah uses wool and to make him a hairy man. But there's also garments and clothing involved in this. And so we're going to look in depth at that. So in Genesis chapter 27 and verse 11, Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, "Behold, Esau, my brother, is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. My father, peradventure, will feel me, and I shall seem to him as a deceiver, and I shall bring a curse upon me and not a blessing." And so she said, listen, just obey my voice. And so he's asking, how do I disguise my identity? Or more, how do I assume the identity of Esau and get away with the trick? So I want to talk for a few minutes about an amazing and fascinating book. It's written by a man by the name of Latif Yahia. And he was an Iraqi man. And the story, the book is called The Devil's Double. And Uday Hussein, which was Saddam Hussein's oldest son, was seriously mentally disabled, in the sense, not just in the disablement of his mind, but he was one sick puppy, and he was a disgusting human. Now, this man is found, the man that writes this book, he is found to be to where he looks like Uday. So Uday takes him and makes him into his double. And this term is fide in Iraqi. So if you want to study an in-depth and mind-boggling account of deception and trying to keep it all in line, read Latif Yahia's book titled The Devil's Double, about the young man who was unfortunate enough to passingly look like Saddam Hussein's most evil son, Uday Hussein. The deception and craft of disguise is unlike anything that we could imagine, because he has to become the evil wickedness of Uday. He writes and says, occasionally, behind an apparently normal face, there lurks a warped brain that is worse than anything a psychologist could imagine. You would need an extra layer of skin, a shawl for your soul. And he says, I can't sit here any longer. And so what in The Devil's Double, what you have is this young man who assumes the identity of Uday Hussein. I think he was an engineer. He was educated. I believe he even had a PhD. So imagine going from this man that is completely coherent, moral, just a good guy, and the next thing you know, you're Uday Hussein's double. Now, the problem is they said, look, there's going to be, and I think in the book, The Devil's Double, he puts him in a red room and makes him, defecate on himself for a week or something before he finally, says, I'll do this. And it's a sick and twisted story. But what's interesting is there's this fine line, right? Where in the beginning, it begins with you're going to assume the identity in the sense of obviously the superficial. You're going to wear the clothes, the uniform of Uday. You're going to show up on the dais, and you're going to sit in the reserved seating that Uday sits in. Okay, and that's one area of assumption of identity. But beyond that, there is an even deeper assumption of the identity. For instance, Uday Hussein would go to a bar. He would normally rape, pillage, beat, kill, intimidate somebody. So there comes this conversation in the book, The Devil's Double, where you are not, they explain to him, look, you're not just some vague, glib look-alike. If Uday was in this room, it's not enough for people to look over here and say, oh, Uday is in the room. You've got to be more than that. You have to do what Uday would have done if he was in that room. And so there comes this tension of this real and true moral conundrum of what do I do when I'm just an engineer, an educated man, and now how do I become the identity of this wicked man? Okay, so that's one of the challenges. Now, clothing has always been a way to disguise identity, okay, both for royalty and for commoners. And even King Saul, if you go back to 1 Samuel 28, he changed his clothes when he went to meet the witch of Endor. Unbeknownst to Saul, however, when he put on these garments, he himself was essentially changed. Not just his clothes were changed. So we have to think about this as we put on identities or take off identities. And when you look at all these, these books and these things that I'm talking about, and especially this one, this is an interesting book that talks about the language of clothes. And it's what clothes say, but he writes in this book and says that in all of its changes, in all of its different variations, one must understand that fashion and taste is not just putting on different garments. It is self-actualizing the inner component of your being. You are more, infinitely more, than what you wear, although what you wear can be an introduction to who you are. So that's in Allison Lurie's book, The Language of Clothes, why people wear what they wear. Now, when you get into this text here, Rebecca, she has to work the garments. And so in verse 16, she put the skins of the kids of the goats upon his hands and upon the smooth of his neck. Okay, so think about that. She has to stitch this together. She has to work it together. And much like Eve had to stitch together this garment of figs, Rebecca is now stitching together this disguise. They had to be sewn together to fit Jacob's body, just as Eve had sewn the fig leaves and God had made garments from skin in the garden. Through her work, she transformed the skin into garments that would enable Jacob to fool his father's sense of awareness. Now, Rebecca didn't only use the skins to make what she wanted, she also incorporated something else. And this is not picked up very often, okay? So she in verse 15, Rebecca took goodly raiment, the best garments of Esau. Okay, so she's not just taking skin. People will just talk about this and preach about this and say, and she put, the skin of kids of the goats upon his hands and upon his neck. So when his father felt him, it felt hairy. But it's more than that. She took out these special garments, these formal clothes that Esau would wear, whatever the Bible calls them, goodly raiments. And what you have is this introduction into garments mean something. For instance, you get dressed up when you go out to a special occasion, to a wedding or to a funeral. There's a certain way that you dress. Funerals normally require you to wear all black or mourning colors. The garments we choose to wear often reflect our attitudes, not only about the situation, but toward those with whom we associate, the value we place on these relationships, as well as our essential natures. Whatever Esau was not, he was a good son. And so the rabbis write that Esau would have put on these special clothes when he attended to his father. And so he donned these special garments to meet his father. He felt it was only proper to wear his most precious garments for this most dignified of tasks, that of attending to his father. Now, clothes carry smells on them. I remember one time my wife, who is Italian and loves garlic, and I'm not so much a fan of garlic. We went to a restaurant in Beverly Hills called The Stinking Rose. And by God, was it a stinking rose. And the place stunk like garlic. They had garlic salad dressing and garlic bread and garlic in the pasta and garlic in all the food. And they even had, I didn't eat none of it, but they even had garlic ice cream and garlic desserts. And it was an appalling place. I think it's went out of business, thank God. But anyhow, I went home and I had a shirt that had been made for me, very nice, fit me well, and I sent the shirt to the dry cleaners, and it came back, and I'm walking around, I smell garlic on this shirt. And so I said, man, this is a shirt I wore to the Stinking Rose. I sent it back to the dry cleaners a couple times and couldn't get the smell out. So finally I just threw the shirt away, because fabric will take in the smell of the wearer or the atmosphere. And so in this way, the clothes bore the smell of Esau. And when Isaac smelled him, he blessed him, okay? And the smell was used in this sense as a multi-sensory concept, okay? So we're going to talk about this in just a minute. Now, once the disguise is in place, it seems to become such an integral part of Jacob that Isaac not only is deceived, but Jacob becomes deceived. And this is the danger with wearing ornamentation or wearing makeup or wearing ostentatious, gaudy things, is if we're not careful, it becomes our identity. And we can no longer see ourselves without that. And so I've had women that have talked to me and said, I am so ugly. Like, I can't fathom saying that, but they felt so insecure. And they felt so worthless or devalued or not youthful enough to where they didn't even feel like they could go outside without having makeup on. And so in that way, that sense of the disguise becomes part of their identity. Once the disguise is in place, it seems to be that it becomes an integral part of our being, that we cannot see ourselves clearly, just as others are unable as well. To recognize the essential makeup of the characters, especially as they change, it is difficult enough. But when they are camouflaged, it is even more of a challenge. By Jacob feigning to be his brother, he was covered with a lie to gain his father's truth. Now, Sam Harris writes in his book in 2013, which is titled Lying. And Sam Harris is no preacher. He's an atheistic guy, but he writes, "What is a lie?" And on page 3 of his book, deception can take many forms, but are all acts of deception a lie? Even the most ethical among us regularly struggle to keep up appearances and reality. By wearing cosmetics, a woman seeks to seem younger or more beautiful than she otherwise would. In this act of deception, she not only lies only to the onlooker, but to her own psyche as well. And this is from a scientist that writes about this stuff. And so when Jacob entered the tent, he calls out in Genesis chapter 27, he came unto his father and said, "My father." And so he cries out, "My father," and then unexpectedly, his father says this, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" So here's the problem with clothing and disguises and wearing things that are not true to form or not integral to our personality and our psyche, is when he asks, "Who are you, my son?" Isaac asks the same thing when Esau returns from the field in Genesis 27 and 32. And Isaac his father said unto them, "Who art thou?" And he said, "I am thy son, thy firstborn Esau." In this way, the text underscores to the reader that identity or lack thereof is the essential concern. Jacob's own confusion about his identity is palpable in the narrative, and the change of clothes both highlights and symbolizes his confusion. It's interesting in this part because basically 4 times Isaac cries out and says, "Who are you?" to one of the boys, one way or another. Okay? Now, when he says, "Who are you, my son?" he's crying out, "I'm confused, although you're giving me all of this information. You feel hairy, you smell a certain way, but I'm still confused." Here's the problem with what we wear if it is ostentatious or it presents something that is not truthful, is the more we try to be accepted by whoever it is we're seeking to deceive, the more confused that father or that person becomes. So you see the cyclical nature of this is how the more he tries to deceive his father to earn his father's trust and love and emotion and feeling, the worse that it actually gets. Okay? And so in this sense, it's a great struggle. Okay? Now, his father, he's wanting his father to believe him. He's wanting his father to affirm him. Okay? But the problem is that the more he tries to put on clothes that deceive, the more what he wants becomes a mirage and evades his grasp. He's wanting his father's ardent affection and love. He deceives his father to get said love and affection, and when he does, his father says, "Who are you?" His father's confusion is palpable. Because all that is fake in us, all the fake assumed identities become hard to juggle and hard to keep in line. And really, who are you, my son? He asks this over and over. In Genesis 22 or 27, verses 22 and 23, "And Jacob went near unto Isaac his father, and he felt him, and he said, Ah, the voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau." So notice the confusion. He's trying to determine there's something wrong here. I can't put my finger on it. Now, anytime that someone puts on a costume in an attempt to deceive, whether that's makeup or whether that's someone wearing fake Gucci to try to impress people. And here's the version of riches that nobody wants to talk about. Riches in America and being rich and wealthy is buying stuff you don't need with money you don't have to impress people you don't even like. And so when we're wanting to impress these people of what we possess and what we have, now we can have the discussion of whether or not it's right or wrong to wear a luxury item. I'm perfectly content, and I've sent out several invites to several different people to come on and have a discussion about an apostolic Pentecostal wearing luxury items, whether or not that's right or wrong, or what is the balance between it. I haven't gotten any feedback on it, but I'm very interested in the conversation. So we could have that conversation, but then there's this other conversation of, well, it's not even real. Okay, then why engage in that? Why try to present yourself as having, owning, or being in a certain socioeconomic scale that is not applicable to you? So there's a whole moral and ethical conundrum about wearing stuff that projects an image that only serves while you're seeking to be affirmed and accepted. It only confuses and becomes a self-defeating exercise the more one does it. And this is what we're seeing in Genesis chapter 27. Once the disguise is in place, it becomes part of his identity. And so anytime that his identity is exposed, if you're cheap or you don't own that, or you don't possess that, or that isn't real, or that's fake, it wounds people so deeply. It cuts. And you're like, come on, dude, it's a $45 purse from China. Why are you offended? Because we want to be accepted, And to be accepted, we choose deceptive means if we're insecure. Those insecurities are projected out through that deception. And when that self-defeating exercise causes people to question you the more, it becomes even more painful because the ruse is displayed. Now, no fewer than 4 times Isaac asks his sons some version of the question, "Who are you?" It appears contrary to popular belief that the disguise only serves to confuse. And so what you have is, you have this strange thing where he says, and he's talking about it, "Art thou my son, Esau?" And he said, "I am." And so he says, "You're hairy, but your voice, I'm so confused by this. Come now and kiss me." Verse 27, he came near and he kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his raiment and blessed him and said, listen to this, "See, the smell of my son is the smell of a field which the Lord hath blessed. Therefore God give thee of the dew." Now that is the most peculiar statement. He says, "See, smell my son." Well, how do you see through a smell? Okay, this is called multisensory perceptions. Okay, so what happens is when people set out to deceive, okay, and they're deceiving people, what happens is when the ruse causes the confusion, you got to use other senses, right? So in the attempt to deceive somebody, let's imagine that I'm deceiving somebody. In that point, they have to start using other forms of discernment. They have to use the sense of smell, or they have to use the sense of hearing or whatever to see whether or not they're really dealing with the real you. So the more we deceive someone, the more confused they are. The more confused they are, the more they import multisensory discernment into it, and that becomes more frustrating, more fearful, and more self-defeating to the person who that is offering the deception. So, contrary to popular belief, it doesn't clear the matter up, it confuses the matter. So much so that his father says, "See, smell, this is my son, who smells like the field that the Lord has blessed." This is exactly what Jacob wanted. This was what he craved. This is his ambition. He desperately wanted this. Did the disguise result in the blessing he wanted? Did it result in love, understanding, or recognition that Jacob so desperately craved? No. It resulted in in confusion and the lack of recognition. And this is an interesting point because of the intense use of deception, Isaac has to be elaborate. He has to use other senses to ascertain who he's dealing with. Jacob, wanting and needing his father to take him at face value, actually causes his father to need to use other senses, resulting in misidentifying him. Through the clothes he wore, through the identity he assumed, he made it impossible for his father to recognize, understand, or value him. And this is what we have to deal with when we're talking about assumed identities, okay? And wearing things that are that are dishonest in a sense. And so in the New Testament, James really hones in on this. Let me find it real quick. He gets very upset because what happens is they're honoring people because of what they possess. Okay? And so he tells them, he says, listen, he says, you shouldn't have respect of persons. For if there comes into the church a man that has a big gold ring or he has goodly apparel, that's the same words that Rebekah uses when she puts Esau's special clothes on him. He comes in and man, he's really got the name brand stuff. And there come in also a poor man in everyday clothes. You have respect to him that wears the expensive clothing and says to him, sit thou in a good place, and you say to the poor, stand here or sit on the floor. Are ye not then partial in yourselves, and are become judges of evil thoughts? Hearken, my beloved brethren, hath not God chosen the poor of this world rich in faith, and the heirs of the kingdom which he hath promised to them that love him? But you to despise the poor. Do not rich men oppress you, and you draw before your judgment seats? Do they blaspheme that worthy name by which you are called? If you fulfill the royal law, according to the Scripture, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But if you have respect to persons, you commit sin, are convinced of the law as a transgressor. So this is a powerful assumption of identity that we're dealing with in Jacob. Jacob's so insecure in himself, he thinks that not only to possess something, but to assume the identity of someone else. So here's what we want to talk about for a minute is the spirit of pride. Everybody can say, well, it's a spirit of pride for someone to wear this or someone to wear that. But it is a spirit of pride that says, I want to wear what someone else has. So to buy something because you think it is a quality garment or you think it is a worthwhile investment of your money, and you're buying it because it's well made, it's craftsmanship, whatever that is, that's your business. But if I buy anything because I'm trying to fit in, I'm assuming a false identity. I'm not wearing shoes and suits and clothes because I want to impress somebody. I'm wearing what I feel like is comfortable and what I'm happy to wear and as my status in life requires. To wear that is part of what I want to do. Okay? I represent the Most High God. I'm an ambassador. I'm a preacher of the gospel, and I want to live and I want to direct myself in my daily life as such. Okay? I'm not wearing it because I want to fit in with anybody. I'm not wearing it because of what I'm trying to assume an identity that isn't mine. It is quite my identity. But if I start changing because I want to fit in with preachers in sneakers, then that's a problem. And in that spirit, when we start buying things, wearing things, whether they be real or whether they be fake, because we are trying to assume someone else's wealth, someone else's identity, or someone else's uniqueness and specialness, then that is sin. And this is where the Lord reprimands the church through James and says, you do not well to be respecter of persons. Quit judging people because of what they wear. Quit believing that they're successful because they dress a certain way or because they own something or because they drive something. Measure them by the integrity of their heart, by the gravitas of their character, and by the sincerity of their walk with God. Do not assume someone's identity, because in doing so, you will lose your own identity and you will fail to be able to get the love, understanding, and respect you so desperately crave. Clothes